Just want to check my balance, said the 90-year-old black woman. Her voice was shaking as it echoed across the shiny marble lobby of First National Bank. People turned to look at her. Some stared with curiosity, some looked annoyed, and some laughed. Quietly, at the center of the lobby stood Charles Hayes, the bank president. He was 52 years old, wore an expensive suit, and carried himself like he owned the whole world. When he heard the old woman speak, he laughed loudly, like it was the funniest thing he had heard all week. But his laughter was not friendly, it was sharp, it was proud, and it cut through the cold air like a knife. Charles had been president of the bank for years. He was to rich people, business owners, investors, people who wore gold watches and spoke softly. To him, the old woman looked like someone who did not belong there. He said loudly, so everyone could hear. I think there is a misunderstanding. This is a private bank. Maybe the small community bank down the street is what you are looking for. The old woman, Margaret, leaned on her old wooden cane and stood firm. Her coat was simple, her shoes were worn out, but there was something strong in her eyes. At 90 years old, she had seen enough in life to know when someone was being disrespectful. Young man, she said calmly, pulling out a black card from her pocket. I said, I want to check me balance. I did not ask for your opinion about where I should bank. She did not shout, she did not beg, she simply spoke. Charles looked at the card with disgust. The edges were old and bent. The numbers were almost faded away. He thought it looked fake, like some cheap promo card company's giveaway. He rolled his eyes. John, he called to his personal assistant, raising his voice. Another person trying to be smart with fake cards. Some rich customers nearby giggled. A few covered their mouths, pretending to hide their laughter. But Margaret did not move. Her face stayed calm. If you looked closely, you would see confidence in her eyes. The kind that comes from someone who has survived many storms in life. Janet walked closer and whispered softly, Sir, maybe we should just check the card quickly in the system. Absolutely not, Charles snapped. I will not waste our time on this nonsense. He waved his hand angrily. Right then, something unexpected happened. Margaret smiled, not an embarrassed smile, not a nervous smile. It was a smile full of stories. The kind of smile that makes people pause. For 1 second, Charles felt something strange in his chest. It was like a warning whisper. Be careful. Booth ignored it. Two security guards started walking toward Margaret. They looked uncomfortable. No one likes being ordered to scare an old woman. And one guard said softly, Mr. Hayes asked us to take you outside. Margaret's eyes changed slightly. A new hardness appeared. She had lived through difficult times, especially growing up in the 1940s. She knew what escort outside used to mean. Young man, she said gently, I did not say I am leaving. I said I want to check my balance. Charles burst into laughter again. See everyone, he said proudly to the lobby. This is exactly why we have security. Confused people trying to use service they don't understand. One rich woman, Mrs. Catherine Vance, lifted her designer handbag to hide her law. Poor thing, she whispered loudly, maybe Alzheimer's. My maid was like that. Then something shocked everyone. Margaret laughed, not weakly, not mockingly. She laughed deeply, like music filling the bank lobby. Alzheimer's she said calmly. Thought is funny because I remember very clear life day I worked 14 hours cleaning your grandfather's office back in 1955. The whole bank went silent. Charles froze. His family had owned the bank since 1903. Not many people knew personal stories about his grandfather. Excuse me, Hesed suddenly unsure. You were 15, Margaret continued. I worked after school so my mother and I could eat. Your grandfather liked to leave cigarettes burning on the marble just to see if I would dare to complain. She looked straight at Charles. I never complained. We needed the money. Janet swallowed hard. She had heard rumors about the old Hayes family, but never like this. Margaret kept speaking, her voice soft. I remember when your grandfather told me that people like Mess would be thankful to serve people like him. He said it was our natural place in life. She gave a sad smile. Funny how family habits pass from one generation to the next. Isn't it, young Hayes? Charles' face turned red. Sweat formed on his forehead. These are just stories, he muttered. Anyone can lie. Margaret looked at him calmly. Your grandfather had a scar on his left hand, she said slowly. He got it the day he tried to break a glass over my head when I was 17. He missed, cut his own hand, and later lied that it was a gardening accident. Silence. Several customers quickly walked out. No one wanted to bother anymore. Charles felt like he was losing control, like everything was slipping away. And then Margaret said something that made the whole room feel heavier. I have spent 70 years wondering if I would ever get the chance to show Hayes' family what someone like McCann truly become once she refuses to stay invisible anymore. Each new humiliation Charles tried to put on Margaret did not break her. Instead, it woke up something deep inside her, something strong and silent. It was that kind of strength that grows slowly over years of unfair treatment. The people standing around her thought they were better than she was. They laughed, they whispered, they judged. But they didn't that every insult was actually bewildering. Something bigger. They were writing their own shame. Margaret had learned something powerful long ago. Patience is not weakness, sometimes patience is strategy. Charles Shays stood there trying to pretend he was still in control, but inside he was shaken. His hands shook slightly. Thoth tried to hide it. Margaret had mentioned very personal details about his grandfather, things almost nobody knew, and now doubt was slowly crawling into his mind. But Charles was proud, too proud. He refused to let a 90-year-old black woman embarrass him in front of rich clients. He raised his voice. Security! He shouted, his voice cracking a little. Remove this woman immediately, and if she refuses, call police. Some people in the lobby gasped. Others stepped back to watch like it was entertainment. Margaret didn't move. Something in her posture changed. Her shoulders straightened. Her back lifted proudly. Suddenly, she didn't look like a fragile grandmother anymore. She looked like a woman who had served a segregation, a racism, a humiliation, an injustice. She lifted her head and stared directly at Charles. Her eyes were sharp and fearless. Charles took a small step back without meaning to. Her voice sliced through the room. Young Hayes, are you sure you want to call the police on a client of your own bank? I believe the newspapers would enjoy that story. The whole lobby froze. It felt like time stopped. Just then, the main doors opened. A tall man walked in wearing a dark suit. He walked like Simeone, who knew the building better than anyone else. His presence alone demanded respect. This was Gerald Simmons, 58 years old, senior vice president, founding board member, one of top people in the bank. The moment Charles saw him, his stomach dropped. Gerald's signature was on Charles's last performance evaluation. Gerald helped decide who stayed and who got fired. Charles, Gerald said calmly. But his tone carried power. Why am I hearing shouting from my office on the 10th floor? Gerald slowly looked around. He saw 2 security guards surrounding an elderly woman, a rich customers whispering nervously, a Charles sweating and red-faced. Gerald understood instantly. He could feel the racial disrespect in the air without anyone saying a word. Charles forced a smile. Gerald, thank goodness you're here. We have a confused woman with fake documents. Gerald raised his hand and walked right past Charles. He went straight to Margaret. His voice turned warm. Margaret, it's so good to see you again. I hope everything is okay. Are you having any trouble with our services? You could hear a pin drop. Noon spoke. No one moved. Charles felt dizzy. How could Gerald possibly know this woman? How? For the first time, fear replaced pride. Margaret smiled for the first time since entering the bank, but it wasn't a sweet smile. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting for this moment for years. Hello, Gerald. I am actually facing some interesting challenges. It seems young Hayes here believes I don't look like the kind of customer this bank should serve. Gerald turned slowly toward Charles. The look in his eyes could have burned a hole through steel. Charles, my office now. Charles tried to defend himself. But Gerald, Gerald repeated louder. His voice filled the entire building. Charles had no choice. Security didn't need to drag him, but Gerald's presence alone made him walk like a guilty child. Margaret watched calmly. Phase 1 of her quiet justice was happening. People in the lobby who had laughed earlier now avoided her eyes. Some shifted uncomfortably. Some looked ashamed. Mrs. Catherine Vance, the one who joked about Alzheimer's, slowly walked up to Margaret. Her voice shook. Excuse me, do you really know Mr. Simmons? Margaret turned to her and smiled quietly. Honey, I taught Gerald Simmons math at a public school in Brooklyn in the 1980s. He was just a bright young boy who needed someone to believe in him. She paused, letting that truth sit in the air. Funny how life goes around in circles, isn't it? Mrs. Vance felt her face drain of color. She realized she had mocked someone who had spent her life teaching, guiding, helping children succeed. A respected educator, someone honorable. Pia Plenterby stopped talking and stared. Pieces of the puzzle were finally connecting. Meanwhile, in the elevator, Gerald stood silently. Charles tried to explain himself in panic. Gerald, listen. She looked out of place. Anyone would have thought. Any racist person would have thought that. Gerald answered coldly. He didn't raise his voice, didn't even look angry, but the truth in his words hit harder than shouting ever could. Margaret isn't just a customer, Charles. She was my teacher. She was the only person who believed a poor kid from Brooklyn could become more than what society expected. The elevator reached the 10th floor. The doors opened, but Girl did not step out. He continued educating. You want to know who Marguerite really is? He didn't wait for an answer. She taught math for 40 years in some of the toughest schools in the city. She guided hundreds of children everyone else gave up on. Charles swallowed. Gerald continued, and when she retired, she invested every penny she had into a scholarship fund to help poor kids go to school. Charles felt weak. How was I supposed to know that? He whispered. Gerald stared at him. Because you should have asked before you humiliated her in public. Because leaders don't judge customers by what they wear or how they look. Because your job is to serve, not to entertain your friends by destroying someone else's dignity. When the elevator doors opened, Gerald walked straight out. Didn't even look at Charles. He simply headed toward his office with quick, firm steps, like a man who already knew exactly what needed to be done. Charles, however, stayed frozen for a moment. He stood in the hallway outside the office in the 10th floor, shaking slightly, feeling like the ground under him was disappearing. Through the large glass walls, he could see Gerald enter his office, sit down, pick up the phone, and start dialing numbers. One number, then another, then another. Each phone call made Charles' heartbeat faster. In his mind, it felt like every call was closing another door in his future, his position, his reputation, his career. And for the first time, that rude bank president felt small, very small. Meanwhile, downstairs in Thelby, things looked completely different. Margaret sat calmly in one of soft brown leather armchairs. Her cane rested beside her. Her posture was relaxed. But her presence filled their room. Employees who earlier looked at her like she didn't belong now approached slowly, their eyes showing respect, curiosity, embarrassment. They no longer saw an old woman. They saw someone important, someone powerful. Someone they had judged too quickly. Johnny, the assistant, who earlier had been brushed aside by Charles, now walked toward Margaret carefully. She held a tablet in her hands, but this time her face was different. Her eyes were respectful. Her voice was gentle. Mrs. Margaret, she said softly. Simmons asked me to help you with anything you need. Would you like to check your balance somewhere more private? Margaret smiled kindly, but there was strength in her voice. No, we will do it right here. She looked slowly around the lobby. People were watching. People who had laughed. People who had judged. People who assumed she was poor and confused. Transparency matters, she added calmly, especially in banks. Some people shifted uncomfortably. They knew what she meant, and it burned. What none of them realized was this: every insult she had experienced that day had not broken her. Instead, it had made her stronger. For years, she had lived with disrespect. A cleaning houses, a teaching in underfunded schools, a being ignored, a being underestimated. Yet, she never let bitterness control her. She chose dignity. She chose patience. And now, at 90 years old, Margaret was about to show all of them that true worth does not come from clothes, wallets, or titles. It comes from character and from preparation. Because Margaret had been preparing for moments like this her whole life. Jonna sat beside her and carefully typed in Margaret's account number. Her hands were shaking. Slowly, carefully, she double-checked every digit. The lobby had turned into a silent theater. Security guards watched quietly. Bankers stood behind their desks. Customers leaned forward, pretending not to stare, but unable to look away. The room held its breath. Jonna swallowed and said softly, Mrs. Margaret, would you like me to read the balance out loud? Margaret nodded calmly. Yes, dear. Loud and clear. This is financial education. Jonna took a deep breath. Her eyes widened. Her voice trembled slightly. The balance in your main checking account is $847,000. For a second, nobody moved. Then the sound hit. A loud murmur swept across the lobby. A purse fell and hit the floor with a solid thud. It was Mrs. Catherine Vance. Her expensive Hermes bag had simply slipped from her hand. Her jaw dropped. Other customers turned with embarrassment. Some looked at their shoes. Some wished they could disappear. The woman they had mocked, the woman some assumed was homeless, had more money in just one account than most of them had ever seen. Margaret simply smiled politely. Then she asked gently, but dear, isn't that only one account? Jonna blinked, then checked again. Her fingers moved across the screen. Yes, you also have an education savings fund with $1.2 million. an investment account with 3.8 million, and she paused. Her throat tightened. She had to read Thella's line twice. And an endowment education fund with $12.4 million. Silence. Actual silence. You could heart air. Conditioner hum. $19 million almost, sitting quietly under the name of a woman everyone thought did not belong there. Margaret, the 90-year-old woman Charles had tried to embarrass, was one of the wealthiest private clients in the bank. Just then, the elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Everyone turned. Charles stepped out. His face looked as if all the blood had drained out of it. Sweat stained his expensive shirt. His hands would not stop shaking. He had just come from a conversation that crushed whatever Pridit had left. Behind him came Gerald.com, serious, unmoved. His voice sliced through the silence. Charles, come forward and apologize properly to Mrs. Margaret. Charles tried to speak. I didn't know. His eyes darted from Margaret to the crowd around him. He could see the judgment. He could feel shame. He could taste fear. Margaret slow stood, her back straight, her chin lifted, her presence commanding. Didn't know what? She asked softly. Didn't know I had money. Didn't know I was respected. Or didn't know you are supposed to treat every human being with dignity, whether rich or poor. Charles opened his mouth. Nothing came out because there was no excuse. Not one. Margaret continued, still calm, but firm. I heard something interesting. Gerald told me how you encourage your workers to look at people's clothes, judge their worth, and make fun of them in front of others to impress the rich. The lobby grew even quieter. People slowly raised phones, some recorded, some live-streamed. The story was no longer just embarrassment, it was no evidence. Charles tried again. Mrs. Margaret, please. She lifted her hand gently. Silence. Her years as a teacher showed instantly. Young Hayes. She said, do you want to know why a retired teacher has $18 million in this bank? He nodded slowly, because now he wanted to understand. Because now, for the first time, he respected her. Margaret took a breath. During 40 years of teaching, I saved and invested 60% of my salary. I lived simple. I drove used cars. I wore clothes until they wore out, and I invested. She looked around Thelby, and not because I love money, but because I knew something you clearly didn't. She paused. The moment felt thievy. I knew that smart investing and education break poverty, so I did openly invest for myself. I invested in children you would never look at twice. At that moment, Gerald stepped closer, holding a file. Charles, you should also know this, he said firmly. Mrs. Margaret is the biggest donor to our scholarship program in the last 10 years. She has paid for 4 to 7 students to go to college. Charles' knees almost buckled. It hit him like a weight on his chest. He hadn't just insulted a millionaire. He hadn't only judged someone unfairly. He had attacked someone who had spent her life lifting others, someone more honorable than he had ever been. And in that moment, Charles understood the full size of his mistake. Not only had he publicly humiliated a multi-million-dollar client, but he had attacked the very Charles had just learned the most painful truth of his life. He had tried to disrespect the very woman whose values the bank used in its adverts: generosity, kindness, and service. And no, everyone could see it. Margaret looked at him calmly, but her smile no longer felt warm. It was the smile of someone who had seen too much to be fooled anymore. And there's more, she said gently. She reached into her coat pocket and took out her phone. Technology is really something, she added quietly. I had been recording everything since I walked in here. All color drained from Charles' face, his throat tightened. In a world where a video spread fast, his cruel behavior could destroy everything he had built, a lifetime reputation gone in hours. Gerald's expression hardened. Margaret turned slightly to him. Gerald, I believe the board of directors should see this. They deserve to know what kind of leadership is guiding this bank, especially since this bank survives only because customers trust its integrity. Gerald nodded slowly. I already called every board member. Emergency meeting 5 p.m. today. Charles, you are suspended immediately while we investigate this incident and your overall leadership. Charles tried to speak. Gerald, you can't. I have responsibilities, family bills. Margaret spoke before he finished. I am 90 years old, she said firmly. And I have spent my whole life proving that human dignity is not for sale. Her eyes did not waver. Every investment I made, every child I helped go to school, every dollar I earned, she paused, all of it came because I refused to let people like you decide my worth. She walked closer. Charles stepped back without thinking. For years, he had used his power to intimidate others. Now he faced one shrinking, The difference between us, Margaret said softly, is simple. You use your power to make people feel small. I use mine to lift people up. He swallowed hard. I use power to control. You use it for opportunity, she continued. The message ate the entire lobby. Silence fell. Everyone knew she was right. Just then, Mrs. Catherine Vance, the woman who had lied earlier, took a step forward. Her voice trembled. Mrs. Margaret, I went to apologize. Truly, I behaved badly. There is no excuse. Margaret turned to her gently. Dear, everyone makes mistakes. What matters is whether we learn or repeat them. Then security approached. Not for Margaret, but for Charles. The same walk he once forced others to take, he was now forced to make. A quiet irony. The lobby watched insolently, and Margaret sat back down like nothing dramatic had just happened to Jeanne. She said calmly, smiling at the assistant, I'd like to make some transfers. I have new students needing scholarships. And at that moment, everyone finally understood. Her true wealth was never the number in her bank accounts. Her real wealth was what shedded with it. She turned injustice into education, shame into lessons, prejudice into opportunity. And while Charles swept out carrying nothing but regret, Margaret remained seated strong and steady. The real winner. Not because she shouted, but because she didn't break. 6 months passed. The bank was no longer the same place. It had changed completely. Policies were rewritten. Training programs rebuilt. Employees learned to treat everyone with equal dignity. And one bright day, Margaret walked through the same lobby, but this time differently. She was no longer the old woman who didn't belong. She was now a member of the board of directors, the first black woman to ever hold that role in the bank's 100-year history. And everyone stood when she entered, not out of fear, out of respect. Charles, however, was not at the bank anymore. Had been fired the very next day. The video of what he did went viral. 12 million views in 1 week. It became Allison used in seminars, schools, and training programs on discrimination. Hatred applying to other banks, but every door closed. The financial world ismal. People talk. His name became a warning. Meanwhile, Gerald looked at their reports one day during a board meeting and said, Since we followed Margaret's inclusion policies, our customers increased by 340%. Profits are at record highs. Every understood. Respect grows business. Discrimination kills it. Margaret didn't stop there. She used her new influence to improve everything. The scholarship program grew fast. Hundreds of students from poor communities now had hope. That December afternoon, Margaret was sitting in her new office on the 15th floor. When Jeanette, now promoted to inclusive service manager, walked in with an envelope. Mrs. Margaret, I wanted you to read this yourself. Margaret carefully opened it. It was handwritten from Marcus Simmons, Gerald's nephew, one of her scholarship students. He wrote, Dear Mrs. Margaret, today I received my first paycheck as an aerospace engineer at NASA. None of this would have happened without your courage. Thank you for believing in me. Tears warmed her eyes. She placed the letter in a drawer along with 847 others she had received over the years. Each one was proof. Lives had been changed, opportunities had grown, seeds had become forests. Across town, Charles now worked as a store clerk. No suit, no office, no authority. He hid his past. He avoided questions. And for the first time in his life, he learned what it felt like to be overlooked, invisible, misjudged, ignored. And it hurt deeply. Meanwhile, Mrs. Catherine Vance, the wealthy customer who once mocked Margaret, became one of the biggest donors to the scholarship program. At first, I thought dignity only belonged to people born into money, she confessed at an event. Now, I know dignity belongs to people who respect others. Soon the city awarded Margaret with honorary citizenship, thanking her for a lifetime of service. At the ceremony, she said, True wealth is not what we collect. True wealth is what we plant. The bank placed a beautiful nameplate at the entrance. Margaret Bennett Educational Center, where opportunity grows from dignity. Gerald, now CEO, often said, Mrs. Margaret taught us leadership isn't about control. Leadership is about lifting others. And even at 91, Margaret kept coming weekly, not to look at balances, but to interview new scholarship students. Every young face reminded her that her quiet battle still mattered. That day long ago had changed everything. She proved something powerful. When we face injustice with dignity and humiliation with determination, we don't only win, we transform the world around us. Charles tried to destroy Margaret, but destroyed only himself. Margaret discovered that real victory is not revenge. Real victory is becoming so successful that your success protects others from being hurt the same way. And if this story touched your heart, Please like, share and subscribe for more interesting stories.